Hey, Acts of the Apostles. This week we're going to look at rhetorical criticism. Rhetorical criticism. Now, you have gotten the 4 chapters from the Ben Witherington book to read and the book by Aun. But I also gave you a handout. And I gave you a handout because sometimes those other books are kind of difficult to read. I get it. So I gave you a handout with some very clear questions that will help you work your way through the rhetoric of your pericope. I'm just going to go over that handout for you. You'll find it by the place you're going to put in your exegetical experiment. So you'll find it there. Here are the questions you're going to be asking. The first question is your biblical passage a rhetorical unit? Is your biblical passage a rhetorical unit? What does that mean? Well, does it have a beginning? Does it have a middle? Does it have an end? And if it does have a beginning, middle, and an end, then it's clearly a rhetorical unit. If it doesn't, you may be picking a part that is part of a larger rhetorical unit. And for the purpose of this exegesis experiment, you want to look at the larger rhetorical unit, keeping in mind that you're really focusing still on your pericope, but definitely keep in mind the larger rhetorical unit. The second question is, what persons, events, or relations in the audience of this biblical passage force the biblical writer to make a response? So you have to now think about, who is Luke writing to? Well, we know at first that Luke is writing to Theophilus, but who else might be in Luke's audience? What is going on in your passage that Luke feels it necessary to tell to that audience? What is it about those persons in that audience, or the situations that that audience is facing, that might cause Luke to want to tell this particular story? Remember, whenever you put a stylus to papyrus, you're spending a lot of money in the ancient world. So you have to have a reason to do all of that work and to spend all of that money. So you want to think about, why would Luke go to the trouble to do this at this time? The third question is, what's the situation at hand? What is the problem in the text? What's the question in the text? What judgment is the audience being asked to give? Whenever somebody tells a story, you're telling a story with an intention for the person receiving the story to make a judgment, to give a judgment. And rhetorical criticism talks about 3 different kinds of judgments. The first kind of judgment is forensic judgment. And the question the audience is being asked to answer is, are these actions just? Did the person act justly? Did the person act in a way that was law-abiding or righteous or justified? Second question is it praiseworthy? Did this person act in a way that was worthy of praise, that is emulatable, is something you should follow? Think about the Hebrews text, Hebrews 12 and 13. Hebrews 11 and 12, where he talks about faith being the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. But then he calls a roll of all these folks and how they've lived these exemplary, faithful lives. And this is something praiseworthy. This is something that people should be imitating. So that would be an example of epidetic argument. Here's a third argument, is deliberative argument, which is it worthwhile? In other words, if you do these things, will the consequence be worthwhile? And so that's a sort of argument that you lay out an argument and you're trying to make people make a decision about their future, not about their past. Most stories are going to be epidetic or forensic. They're either going to be raising up something that's praiseworthy, or they're going to ask the audience to make a judgment. They're not as often going to be deliberative. Then you want to look at the arrangement of the author's arguments. What steps does the author take to build up the argument for the audience? So what specific things does the author put in specific orders? One way to help you arrange those steps in your head is to think about, what kinds of argument does the author put forth? So does the author argue from his or her own authority, which is called pathos? Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ and a slave to the church in Galatia. So here's Paul arguing from his own authority. Or when he, in Philippians, goes through his whole biography, here's Paul arguing from his authority. There is the emotional form of persuasion. I'm in labor with you again, church in Galatia, until I give birth to you. I yearn for you like a newborn, like a nurse yearns to breastfeed her own children. This is Paul speaking to the churches in Galatia and Thessalonica. So again, you're dealing with something that's invoking emotion in people. In the Gospels, when Herod goes through and kills all the babies under 2, that's evoking emotion in people. That's a passionate story. It's something that's supposed to have you make an emotional reaction. This is not a reaction having to do with the authority of Matthew. It has to do with your own gut, your own emotion. And the third kind of argument is an appeal to reason, an appeal to this is how it works. This is the inductive or deductive argument. So think back to James, and when James asked, do you want me to show you that faith without works is not dead? Abraham, when he did his thing, was he justified by faith or by works? Clearly by works. When he offered his son, he's laying out a deductive argument. That's no longer an emotional argument. That's now a reasoned deductive or inductive argument. So again, the 3 kinds of argument: pathos, an appeal to one's own authority; ethos, and a kind of a persuasion out of emotion; and logos, a persuasion out of inductive or deductive argument. So the final question then for rhetorical criticism is it effective? Did it work? And that's a decision that you alone can make. You're now the audience. Does this author persuade you? Does Luke persuade you? If Luke does not persuade you, why not? And of course, you have your ideological hat on, so you're probably not persuaded by some ideological things. I was amused by the argument going on in this week's forum about whether or not the slave girl in Acts 16 is set free or not. Fantastic argument. That's exactly the right argument. But that means that you're no longer persuaded by Luke Acts. You're asking a different question that the author doesn't give you. So those are the sorts of questions you need to answer as you think exegetically. Now, what does this look like when we're reading Acts? Let's look back at the pericope I looked at last week, Acts 14, 4-20. Now, this again is a healing at Lystra. Let's look at it again, and we see that it's 2 rhetorical units. The first rhetorical unit is the story of the man who is healed and the reaction of the crowd. And the second rhetorical unit is the arrival of the Judeans from Antioch and Iconium and the stoning of Paul. And so since these are 2 separate units, we're going to look at the 2 separate units slightly separately. What's the rhetorical situation? Well, in both cases, Luke is writing Acts to some Theophilus with the purpose of laying out the story of the church, the growth of Christianity. Luke has in his audience, probably in addition to Theophilus, Jews and Gentiles. And what's interesting about the story of the healing at Lystra and the stoning of Paul is that neither one of these folks comes off looking terribly good. The Jews are depicted as murderously jealous, and the Gentiles as hopelessly superstitious. The only one worthy of praise in this ultimately is Paul. This seems to suggest that the author is trying to show Theophilus just how hard it was to spread the gospel for Paul and why it was so difficult for Paul to spread the gospel. What's the rhetorical problem? Well, the story about Paul healing the lame man is an epidetic story. It's intending to get the audience to decide whether or not Paul is worthy of praise. And of course, the answer is yes. Paul is worthy of praise. He is healed. He has resisted the attempt to turn him into a god. He has appealed to the God of the universe. Paul is worthy of praise. The second story is the story of the stoning of Paul, and it's a judicial story. So here someone has been essentially sentenced to death by the crowd and stoned to death. And the question the author is asking the audience is that stoning just? Were those who acted in the crowd acting justly? And of course the author expects you to say no, because we've already established that Paul is worthy of praise. And so you see how these 2 arguments work together. Let's look at these arguments step by step. And here I'm going to connect arrangement and argument so you see how they come together. Step 1 in the healing. The narrator, we don't know who, the narrator, obviously it's Luke, but Luke separates Luke's self from the narrator. So the presumed narrator presents a man who is lame from birth. This is an appeal to emotion. Men should not be lame. People should not be lame. People can't work. Therefore, it's an appeal to emotion. You're wanting to feel for this person. The author tells us that this person has a faith to be healed, and Paul, looking intensely at him, heals them. This is all an appeal to ethos. This is all an emotional piece. Then the narrator builds on the emotion of the moment by showing the crowd's misunderstanding what has happened, and declaring Paul and Barnabas to be gods, and going to get the wreaths, and bringing in the priest of Zeus, and all. Again, the emotion is building some more. And then the climax of the emotion of the narrative is Paul and Barnabas tearing their clothes and running out into the streets and trying to appeal to the crowd. So again, you've got this deeply emotional, passionate story being told, and this is something the author is trying to get you into, to appeal to you. Well, Paul's speech then starts with ethos. Why are you doing this? This is an emotional question. What are you doing? And then pathos. We are mortals just like you, appealing to the authority of the author, and then to logos, arguments about who God is and how God made the universe. So you see Paul using those three kinds of arguments. And what the narrative tells us at the end is that this is only somewhat successful, because the crowd is still very worked up and still wanting to make Paul and Barnabas into gods rather than actually hearing Paul's argument. So the unspoken question here again is Paul praiseworthy? Is Paul doing what Paul should be doing? And obviously the answer is yes. Then in the stoning, which is much shorter, the narrative tells us that the Judeans come from Antioch and Iconium and persuade the crowd. Now here again, you've got ethos, the emotion, but you've also got pathos, because they come with some authority and they're appealing to their own authority. The crowd stones Paul. That's a hugely emotional action. That's a judicial action. It's based on high emotion. And then the disciples surround Paul and he gets up again, more high emotion. So this is all a statement of ethos here. And the question is, was the action to stone Paul just? And of course, the narrator expects you to say, no, it was not. Paul did nothing wrong. So what do you think? Is Luke effective in making his argument in the case in Lystra? And what about your pericope? Is Luke effective in making his argument in your pericope? I look forward to hearing what you have to say and reading what you have to write, and I will see you in the forums. Take care.